July 8th, 1965, Vancouver. Canadian Pacific Flight 21 would take off from the airport, hauling 46 passengers and 6 crew members. The flight was set to have several stops, with the first being at Prince George, a flight that normally would take about an hour and a half. It was actually an exciting moment for most of the passengers, as commercial air flight was relatively new, and pretty much every one of the travelers had never flown before. But that excitement would change to fear about halfway through the flight, because at 3:29 p.m., the cockpit crew would touch back with Vancouver Air Control in a routine check-in. They would notify them that they were on schedule and were set to arrive at Prince George at any time. But it's just a few minutes after this check-in that air traffic control would try to get into contact with the crew again, and this time they were met with silence. At first, they were not super worried, but were curious as to why there was no response. And just 2 minutes later, 3 brief transmissions came in. Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. And then, silence. Air traffic control, hearing this, would look to radar to see that the aircraft had vanished. It wasn't long after this, calls started coming in to first responders, as witnesses in the town known as 100 Mile House reported they had heard a tremendous explosion in the air, and that when they looked up, they seen a plane overhead split apart and the tail broke away, and they seen objects spilling out. As the plane made a nosedive into the forest, it would cartwheel and ignited the surrounding trees, causing a wildfire. Yeah, and of course, those objects that were seen spilling out were sadly people. The police, EMS, and firefighters made it on the scene shortly, along with the forestry workers, but they were unable to enter the inferno. The area would burn all night long before it was finally extinguished completely the next day, and responders were finally able to get safely in, and they discovered a scene of carnage. There were seats, luggage, various aircraft parts, pieces of bodies, and whole bodies, 29 of which were still strapped to their seats. And obviously, this was a tragic accident. But where is the mystery? Well, see, this was not an accident. Actually, it didn't take long at all for investigators to determine the flight had been brought down by a bomb. There was too many things that pointed towards it, like paint chips that had been blasted into the victim's skins, or an overnight bag that had been found about 1,000 feet away. But maybe the most indicative part was the X-ray evidence, which found a piece of metal that came from a detonator. Air crash investigators began the long process of reconstructing the parts of the plane and would eventually release the official cause, which most everyone already knew. The disaster had been caused by a massive explosion near the rear of the plane in the lavatory. Of course, the next logical question, and the one that brings us to our mystery, who would do such a thing? Well, because this was such a huge case, and because the investigation had dragged on, rumors began to circulate to fill the void left by detectives, and there were many. One of the first, and biggest to spread, was the one about a strange man seen leaving the lavatory right before the plane took off. This one was soon followed by the one about a flight attendant who was smuggling explosives for her boyfriend by hiding them in the bathroom and they accidentally exploded. As time went on, these rumors got crazier and crazier, and investigators would run every one of those down and found out they were exactly that, just rumors. Investigators never really believed them anyways, and they were more focused on the people that were scheduled to fly that day. Soon, they would have psychological profiles drawn up of each individual on the flight, as well as having background checks done on each. Soon, they narrowed the pool of 52 individuals down to 4. First was a 40-year-old man named Douglas Edgar, who had just bought a life insurance policy for $125,000. And when I say just bought it, I mean he literally purchased it in half an hour before getting on board. He was known as a big gambler, and prior to this, he had told family that he was flying to Prince George where he intended to work at a pulp mill. Soon investigators would go to this mill and found out that no such job offer existed, meaning he had no reason to be on that flight. He also brought very little clothing. Soon, theories began to emerge that he orchestrated the entire thing for financial gain. However, police could never prove that he was involved, other than he just happened to buy a life insurance policy before getting on board. And really, that's not as crazy as it sounds, because in the 60s, it was common to buy insurance from coin-operated vending machines at airports. Pretty crazy, huh? And he also did not have any experience working with explosives, unlike the next person of interest, a 54-year-old man, Stefan Kozar, who was a mining explosives expert. He was known to have a really bad temper, and he was also previously charged and acquitted of murder just 7 years prior. He had told people he was on his way to a new job. However, once police began looking into him, they soon speculated that someone with a temper like his didn't really match with the cold, calculated nature of bombing an airline, and without any other thing to go on, he could not be linked either. The third individual was a young man also flying to a summer job, named Peter Broughton. He was widely known as a gun enthusiast, and he had many in his collection. He was also a loner, described as being isolated. When investigators searched his home, they found 3 pounds of gunpowder was missing from his inventory. However, bomb experts were fairly confident that the powder missing from his home did not match the powder used in the bomb. Regardless, the lead investigator for the Department of Transportation, who worked closely with the RCMP, later stated he believed that the police thought Broughton was the man behind it, with the motive of notoriety. There seemed to be a theory that he could cause a small explosion which would force the plane to make a crash landing and he would survive. Other investigators simply thought he planned to bring it down on himself and others. In fact, his mother had told investigators that Peter had told her not to go into his room for several days because there was something dangerous in there. Whatever it was no longer there by the time the police searched his room, although they had found that he had checked 2 books out of the library weeks before this. One was a book about airliners, complete with schematics of the exact model he was set to fly on. Finally, was a man named Paul Vandermeulen, who actually brought a gun on the plane with him, although, again, that was not that odd for these times. His body was found with copper fragments in it, which suggested he was close to the bomb, and he was noted to have been mentally unwell and was described by a psychiatrist as having a deep madness towards the world. In fact, he was noted by his doctor of being capable of, quote, violent, irrational acts. This is important because his doctor made that analysis before the crash ever happened. There was also speculation that he carried the gun on board, perhaps to control people. But like the other persons of interest, there were issues. Like carrying the gun on board, along with a lot of cash, doesn't really seem like the behavior of someone planning on bringing themselves down in a plane crash. However, another theory soon emerged. A man named Clement King, who had been employed by a firm that kept records of a major investment company. That investment company had just collapsed a few months earlier, and it was all because of fraud, one of the worst fraud cases in Canadian history, causing many investors to lose everything. And the fraud, of course, was discovered by the firm that employed King, and soon detectives wondered if King had been targeted due to his knowledge of the fraud. But realistically, how many assassins are going to be willing to bring themselves down in a plane with their own target? And it may be at this part you think, well, how do we know that the bomb was placed on board by a passenger? What about the strange man that was seen leaving the lavatory right before takeoff? Well, about that, explosives investigators had a good explanation. There was no timer ever found, and it instead was set off by a delayed ignition, which was flipped and triggered the explosion seconds later, meaning the person had to be on board. Even stranger was the bomb itself. When bomb experts began looking into it, they eventually discovered that the bomb was actually 2 different types taped together, like a hybrid, which investigators never really could figure out why. The case has been cold for decades now, and it's almost certain that it will never be solved. But we'll go over the most likely suspects before we close this out. Today, most seem to believe that it was Peter Broughton. Next is Paul Vandermeulen, whose psychiatrist had marked him as a person who could commit violent irrational acts before the flight. Surprisingly, Douglas Edgar and Stefan Kozar have basically been ruled out at this point, and most suggest that if it wasn't Broughton or Paul Vandermeulen, then it could have been a disgruntled airline employee who just had a vendetta against his employer. In 1905, a man named Sir Cecil Edward Denny would publish a set of memoirs entitled The Riders of the Plains, a reminiscence of the early and exciting days in the Northwest. Denny, although not as widely known as some of his contemporaries who moved westwards across Canada, had a storied career. He was born in England in 1850 and would make his way across the Atlantic in 1874, where he would soon be instrumental in the founding of the Northwest Mounted Police. During that time, he would rise to the rank of inspector, and he would even be one of the signatures on the Treaty 7, which was an agreement between the Canadian government and several First Nations tribes, specifically the Blackfoot. After working for the police for about 10 years, he resigned and became an official for the Federal Indian Department, and maybe the height of his career was when he was placed in charge of several Western Native peoples after the Northwest Rebellion, so it's with no wonder that there would be an interest in his memoirs, as he was at the front of a lot of the important parts in Canadian history. But it's in one chapter in this book that our mystery comes from, the one called A Strange Adventure, where Denny would record in the summer of 1875 that he was traveling along the Oldman River near Lethbridge, Alberta, Canada, en route to the foothills to do some fishing and hunting. It was around noon at Denny's camp when dark clouds began to gather in the north, and then the sound of thunder in the distance found its way to his ears. Since he was only halfway through his trip, he decided to move as fast as possible, so he headed west. But it just got darker and darker. He knew a severe storm was rolling in, and while the storms in the mountains did not last long, he knew they could get intense, and from all signs, this one was going to be rough. And Denny was not wrong. This storm was a bad one. The wind was very strong. Heavy rain poured down, which was then followed by hail. The lightning was the worst part though. It seemed to strike constantly, only to be followed by the thunder, which seemed to rattle the air. By this time, Denny had made it to his lifeboat, but was struggling to get anywhere, as the wind kept blowing him shore to shore. Plus, the river was just so choppy, he ended up sitting in water up to his waist, with sheets of water blowing over him every now and then. He soon realized he was wasting his time and was not going to be able to get to his destination. Plus, it was getting dark, although it was only about 4 p.m. So he stopped and decided to just try and find shelter and wait the storm out. He soon spotted a patch of trees on the bank and made his way towards it. And as he got closer to the shore, the storm calmed down some. And it was then, after it got quiet, that he could hear drums and voices. And he knew he was not far from an Indian camp, and he'd already been told before he went on this expedition that this very camp was in the area. So he landed, tied up his boat, grabbed his gun, and moved towards the ever-beating drum. But by now, the storm had started again, and this time, it was worse than before, with the lightning flashing to the point that he felt blinded, and the thunder felt like an earthquake. He began moving faster, trying to keep away from the trees, knowing the danger of being close to one in a storm. Finally, he came to a large clearing in the distance, about 200 yards away, and he seen the Indian camp. There were men, women, and children moving around the lodges, but something struck him as odd. Typically during a storm, the Indians would keep their tents closed, because they believed that the thunder was the sound of their god tossing rocks from the mountains, and because of that, they always stayed inside. Looking around, he would see about 20 lodges and a band of horses grazing nearby, and he stood there for a moment, trying to figure out which one to approach. But as soon as he took a step forward, the sky lit up with lightning, which was followed by the loudest clap of thunder, so loud it nearly knocked him out. He soon realized that beside him, the lightning had hit a tree, splitting it in half, and the shock from it threw him down to the ground. It took him a minute to regain his senses, but now getting inside on one of these lodges and getting protection with the Indians was the top priority, because this was a very dangerous storm. So it must have stunned Denny to look up and see that the camp was gone. The storm was still raging, but he was able to see well enough to know that everything was gone. No tents, people, or horses. He tried to make sense of what had happened, but it was unexplainable, and now he began to panic. And without even thinking, He ran towards the river about a quarter of a mile away, dropping his gun as he went. He finally made it and looked back, and there was still no camp. Nothing, other than the storm and the trees. He was exhausted, but had few choices. He was too scared to go back to the boat, so he made the long walk down the river to a fort about 15 miles away. He was soaking wet and made it about midnight and went straight to bed without telling anyone. He was just too tired. The storm raged all night. The following morning, he would get up and went to breakfast and began telling his fellow officers what had happened. They all just laughed and stated he imagined the whole thing. But Denny knew what he had seen, and he planned on going back to that very spot to see for himself. He knew he wasn't crazy, so he left again, this time with an Indian guide and an interpreter. When they got there, it was completely desolate. There wasn't even any sign that a camp had been there recently. Just some old stone rings and overgrown grass. The interpreter told him the area had been the site of a massacre when the Blackfoot tribe attacked and killed a Cree settlement years ago. The three then did a simple search of the area and pretty quickly found 2 old skulls in the grass. They also found that the tree had been struck by lightning, and he also found his gun and boat. Denny would then close the account by saying he knew that it had happened. He was sure of it, but he just couldn't explain it. So what are our theories? We'll start with the most likely, and the one that's mentioned most by skeptics. Denny witnessed a hallucination due to the extreme stress that he was under. He had for quite a while been exposed to the cold and was soaking wet on top of being exhausted. It's thought that the adrenaline from this life-threatening storm triggered the Indian camp. In fact, both lightning strikes and hypothermia can induce vivid visual and auditory distortions. Next is a little bit crazier. Is it possible that Denny suffered a brief neurological disturbance caused by the bolt of lightning hitting so close to him, which delivered a strong electromagnetic pulse? One example of this is called migraine aura, which is a neurological phenomenon that precedes or accompanies a migraine attack, which can cause visual disturbances as well as sensory changes. Or it's more than likely he suffered what is known as a transient neurological event, or TNE for short, a temporary neurological symptom or episode that revolves itself within a short period of time, leaving no permanent damage. Basically, a mini stroke, which can cause one to see complex visual scenes or even flashbacks. Another often suggested theory is it was simply a mirage. With a rapid shift in temperature, the river could have bent light in such a way that it caused a projection of something on the riverbank, maybe like distant smoke or a camp. But of course, you all want to hear the crazy theory that Denny had one of the earliest known examples of a time slip. Believers of the unexplained phenomena believe that Denny was somehow transported back in time to that Cree camp where he had seen all these tents and Indians moving around on the bank, ignoring the storm, because there was no storm, meaning that he had went back prior to the Blackfoot's invasion and massacre of the tribe. But what do you guys think? On the night of June 7th, 1971, Rosedale, Alberta, Canada, a woman named Esther Clappison was at her home that she shared with her brother Bill when they would experience one of the most bizarre cases of unexplained phenomena in Canadian history. It all started when Esther was sitting alone in her home enjoying the quiet night, when all of a sudden a light shined in through the window in the house and never ceased. Curious as to why someone was outside just shining this bright ray into her home, she eventually got up and, along with her dog George, left the house and started walking around the driveway towards the road to see exactly who it was shining it into the home. She finally found it, sitting out in the field. As she got closer, she spotted a luminous rectangular object about 20 foot long and 7 feet wide, standing nearly 8 foot high. The object, whatever it was, had an entrance where the white light poured out from the interior, revealing that it was an aircraft of some kind. Esther didn't know how to react, so she paused, staring, and was then even more shocked when she spotted 2 humanoid beings moving around inside. But her eyes would then focus on the field behind the craft, and she was stunned to see Another one of these weird beings was moving around there. She would describe them as wearing gray tight-fitting uniforms with broad hoods, similar to that of a diver suit. Their hands appeared to have been covered by pointed mittens that had long thin thumbs and fit over the very narrow wrist. She could not see facial details because they were covered by the fabric of the same sort that made up their bodies. However, she could see their eyes, which she described as looking like keyholes. Looking down, she could not see any curves in the knees or elbows and did not see their feet at all. She looked back towards the craft and noticed on the inside that one of the walls seemed to be covered by a control panel. While staring at that, the entities were finally made aware of her presence. Because of this, the being tried to stand in front of the entrance with his arms stretched out, blocking the view of the control panel. The second entity was slightly leaning on the outside on the right side of the craft's wide doorway, and then the first one made some kind of gesture to get the attention of the third one, which was still in the field about 20 feet away. This being now appeared to have been collecting samples of rocks nearby before it turned around and approached the craft. Esther tried to get closer, but her dog pulled her back in a state of panic. She soon hurried back to get her brother to come back down and look, and after being gone only a short few minutes, they returned to find the object had vanished, which seems to be typical in these cases. However, when they went out the next day to look at the field again, they actually found a rectangular shape burned into the grass at the exact position where the UFO had landed, and these matched the dimensions that Esther described, although at least one source states that only partial marks were there, indicating that it was possibly hovering. Regardless, the area was studied further, and it was found that the heat level the grass was exposed to was the equivalent of a forest fire. 4 months later, the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization came out to look at the site and found that the darkest part of the grass was still there. So crazy story, right? But what about the theories? Well, these are just as crazy. But we'll start with some of the more level-headed ones first. Like, the whole thing could have just been a misidentified civilian vehicle or equipment. Think about a flatbed truck or farm equipment with strong floodlights, maybe working late some evening. He would totally explain the glowing box she said she's seen. Not to mention, this is a rural area that is known to have a lot of agricultural and oil field equipment. Workers in overalls could be mistaken for humanoids, while a tarp or canvas could look like a smooth surface vehicle, while the burn in the grass could have simply came from the exhaust from the vehicle while it was parked. Of course, that doesn't explain why she didn't hear the engine noise. There's also the possibility that there were no crafts there, and because of the darkness and her nervous dog, Esther's mind filled in the unexplained scene with these humanoids and craft. Basically, she saw an illusion. Of course, others say she hoaxed the entire thing because this was at a time when UFO sightings were big in the news. Of course, you also have the secret military aircraft theory where the government was testing this craft out. That could explain why it took place under dark and why they were wearing these greenish-gray suits, along with trying to hide that control panel. But another theory you're waiting on is what if it was a real UFO that was for some reason hovering in this location? Maybe that third being had gotten off the craft to take samples of rocks for some bizarre reason. Or maybe they were just taking multiple samples from Earth. Regardless the reason, it's a crazy case, and I'd love to hear what you think. September 1906. In the small town of Cobalt, Ontario, a group of men building the framework of a mine would spot a creature that has long intrigued the cryptid community. It all began when off in the distance, they spotted a creature walking on 2 legs. This thing was about 7 to 8 foot tall and near 400 pounds, covered in dark brown, almost black hair. But the most odd characteristic was its yellowish blonde hair that stuck out like a sore thumb, eventually leading to this thing's name, Old Yellowtop. Over the duration of working on this mine, they would continue to see the creature off in the distance, and even seeing it relatively close a few times. They reported that whatever it was, it did not seem aggressive or territorial, more like it was curious than anything else. However, construction on the mine was finally completed later that year, and the men packed up and left. And that was it for a while. Actually, for about 2 decades. It would then be in 1923 that 2 prospectors in Cobalt were out working in the woods when they came upon what they first believed was a bear. It was crouched down under a bush eating blueberries and did not see the men. Since it was blocking the path, they figured they needed to scare it away, so one of them decided to toss a large rock at it and hit it from behind, and sure enough, they did. And then the rock bounced off its back, and the creature jumped up 2 feet, turned towards the men, walked forward a bit to get a better look, and then walked away. They would describe it as being covered in black hair, but having yellowish on top, and then the men assumed, whatever it was an adult. After this, and a few more sightings, the cryptid would become well known around the area, but it went into hiding again and wasn't spotted until 1947 by a woman and her child, and they stated he was walking along the edge of the forest heading towards the lake. The creature by this point would have been about 40 plus years old. Searchers did eventually find the big tracks left behind, and some reported hearing growls coming from the forest that night. The final sighting, and maybe the most important, came in 1970 when a bus driver taking 27 miners to work seen a much older yellow top crossing the road directly in front of the bus. It actually caused the driver to slam on the brakes to avoid hitting it, and this driver had always stated he had not believed the story of Yellow Top and thought that people really seen a bear, but after this, he would state that he was wrong and that Yellow Top was definitely not a bear, because it walked too smoothly and effortlessly on 2 legs. Now what's interesting with this sighting was not only were there 28 witnesses, but they described the same creature, yet more mature. The yellow hair on its head was now a yellowish white and hung down to its shoulders. By this point, the creature would have been 60 plus years old, which might be why it was the final sighting, most likely passing away from old age. And while this sounds like nothing more than another wild cryptid tale, in this case, we do have at least one photo, one that is well known in the cryptid world, but it has just as much confusion around it as the cryptid itself. It is often mistakenly referred to as the 1923 Old Yellow Top photo, but it was not taken in 1923. Here's where it gets conflicting. Some sources claim it was taken in 1978, which would mean that it happened after the last confirmed sighting in 1970, while another source claims it happened in 1976, so it's just mislabeled on various sources. Regardless, we know it happened sometime in the 1970s. Of course, the photo is in poor quality, so you can't really see anything, and a lot of people think it's just a sunlit branch or log, or maybe even a doctored photo. But it's time for theories. What do you think it was? Well, looking online, the theory that comes up most often is a black bear. Actually, in 2 of the sightings, 1923 and the one in 1970s, the witnesses at first thought it was a bear. And actually, bears can develop yellow stained or sun-bleached patches, especially after feeding on berries, which could explain the yellow top on its head. Next we go to a hoax. I mean, there's only the one photo, and the quality is terrible. Not to mention, many point out things on the photo which indicate that it was altered in some way. Of course, it's also possible that people are just seeing faces in random patterns. Next, it simply could have been a hermit, choosing to live off the grid in crude fur garments and letting his blonde hair grow out on top, giving the appearance of a wild man, which could explain why it was spotted with white hair in the 1970s, although this doesn't explain the estimated height of 7 to 8 feet and weighing close to 400 pounds. Finally, we have to touch upon, what if this was a regional variant of a Sasquatch, maybe a cousin to the Bigfoot, sorta like the Yeti or the Yowie in Australia. Maybe it was the last of its kind, which is why it has never been spotted again. August 1982, 19-year-old Diane Bélanger of Montreal was taking one of the first steps to becoming an adult, and by that I mean moving out of her parents' home and into her own apartment. But just like now, finding housing was difficult, even more so in a city like Montreal. But she already had one picked out that she planned on moving into. Now she just needed to wait for it to open. In the meantime, Diane looked for a temporary solution, and her boyfriend actually had an idea. He would introduce her to his cousin and her husband, who agreed to let her stay for a while, and Diane, who would only need to stay for a few days, offered to babysit the couple's young child in exchange for them allowing her to crash there. With the arrangement worked out, she would move into her temporary home, and on the night of the 7th, the couple would go out on a date, while Diane remained behind and took care of the child. And it's later that night around 3 a.m. that this couple came back from their date night with some leftover pizza, which they would share with her. They then sat up for a little while and chatted before going off to bed. All in all, a pretty uneventful night. However, this would change completely by the next morning, because when this unnamed couple got up, they would walk into the living room to see that Diane was gone. Even more disturbing, her purse was laying on the floor with all the contents laying around the room. The two were confused and went to the bathroom to check, and here they found Diane's nightgown was in the bathtub. Going back to the living room, they noticed the screen door had been torn open, and a bread knife was missing from the kitchen. Now, despite all this strangeness, there wasn't any sign of a struggle. The police were called, obviously, and they would begin looking over the scene. They were baffled too. How did all this happen while 3 people were asleep nearby in a rather small apartment, and none of them heard anything going on and woke up? Secondly was the door. It was quite common at this time for residents at the apartment to leave their doors open in the summer because there was no air conditioning. Thus, the locked screen door was used to allow some air movement in and out of the room, so that was not found odd by the police. But looking at the screen that had been torn open, they noticed it had been torn open from the inside, not the out, which just made it even creepier. Investigators, not really sure what to think, began to question this couple about Diane and about the previous night. They obviously didn't have much either, since they slept through all of it. But they did have one clue for the investigators. Turns out, when the 3 were up eating pizza just hours earlier, Diane had mentioned the day before she had a sneaking feeling that a man had been following her down the street, only to stop once she entered the apartment. It was not much, but at least it was a lead. And since Diane was not known to have enemies or be mixed up in a risky lifestyle, detectives assumed her disappearance and the weirdness of the apartment came about because of this stranger. Although it is weird how he got in, and he did all this without making a sound, and for some reason, the screen had been torn from within. Regardless, they would begin going down the rabbit hole, but a couple of days later, another lead would come up that would turn this investigation on its head. Investigators were told of a woman in a nearby hospital that had crucial information about the case. When the lead investigator arrived, he found this individual had been recuperating from a severe beating that she claimed had been given by people close to her, and this woman's name was Diane Bélanger. Even crazier, this Diane had the same birthday as our missing Diane. And finally, the two lived nearby to each other. Weird, to say the least. But it's what she told investigators that took this weird anomaly and made it dark. See, this Diane was a drug addict and sex worker, and feared for her life. She claimed someone in her, quote, network wanted her dead, although, for what reason, was never shared to the public. She told police whatever happened to Diane was due to mistaken identity. She believed she was the target, and someone digging for info found the wrong Diane, broke in, took her away, and did away with her, never knowing they had the wrong one, or possibly after discovering their mistake, felt like they had no choice but to kill her. This other Diane would give detectives the general area for them to go look for her because she was certain they would find the body. However, numerous searches would take place, and nothing like that was ever found. And that's pretty much it. Over 4 decades later, and the case is seemingly at the same place it was at the beginning. It's just one with so many weird clues. We've already went over it, but it has to be mentioned again. Just how in the world was nobody awoken? And why was the screen pried apart from the inside? And what about that missing bread knife? Could something like a bread knife be used to keep Diane cooperative and quiet? And why was her nightgown thrown in the bathtub? And we didn't even discuss the metal spiral staircase at the apartment, which was noisy and often woke up the occupants inside. This is also ignoring the fact that the neighborhood is pretty densely populated, and although it was late at night, it's crazy that no one's seen anything. Most importantly, was this simply a case of mistaken identity? Did they believe this Diane was the sex worker and drug addict? Well, it does make some sense, since our Diane had no enemies and was known to be a, quote, good girl. But what kind of kidnapper does not at least get the bare minimum details right? I mean, remember, Diane had just moved into this apartment. How would they even know that? Even if there was a phone book that the abductors could have got the info, her name would have not shown up since she had just lived with her parents up to that point. Secondly, why go there without a weapon and hope to find one once he got there? This leads us to the next theory that the sex worker Diane lied for who knows what reason, or possibly, maybe she really did suspect this is what had happened. Regardless, it had nothing to do with it, and instead, this abduction came from the inside. Possibly her boyfriend, or her boyfriend's cousin and her husband. Maybe one of these three people were responsible, or all of them were, and then staged the crime scene, which explains why it was so weird and doesn't make sense. This would also explain the no forced entry and the purse's contents thrown around randomly. However, police, after interviewing at least 60 people, were convinced that no one in that apartment or anyone close to Diane was responsible, which of course brings us to the last theory, that it was just a random stranger. No doubt, the guy following her home the day before. He broke in, takes that knife, and leads her out. Maybe she grabs her purse and the contents fell to the floor. He keeps her quiet with a knife and makes her change out of the nightgown before they leave, knowing that it would draw attention. Of course, this still doesn't explain the metal staircase, which was apparently pretty noisy and would make a groaning sound so loud that it woke up people. But I'll close it here and ask you, what do you think? And that brings us to the conclusion of this installment of the Canadian Unsolved Mysteries. I hope you guys enjoyed. Goodbye and good night.